Chapter 1. The Foundation. Marshall Crane believed in building things that lasted. At 34, he'd transformed his grandfather's modest construction business into Crane Development, the most respected commercial real estate firm in Portland. His buildings didn't just fill skylines, they defined them. The oak-paneled office on the 20th floor bore his nameplate, but Marshall rarely sat behind the desk. He preferred the construction sites, the blueprints, the tangible reality of creation. That hands-on approach had earned him a reputation, brilliant, principled, and worth every cent of his estimated $40 million fortune. His brother Lance had always been different. 2 years younger, Lance possessed their mother's charm but lacked Marshall's discipline. While Marshall built empires, Lance built excuses. Failed businesses, failed relationships, failed promises. Their father, Harold Crane, had tried setting Lance up with management positions at Crane Development, but incompetence couldn't hide behind nepotism for long. Marshall had been patient. Family meant everything to him. When Lance's third startup collapsed, Marshall paid the debts. When Lance's wife left him, Marshall offered him the guest house behind his Lake Oswego estate. That was 5 years ago, and Lance had been there ever since, supposedly getting back on his feet. Then there was Carrie. They'd met at a charity gala 10 years ago, her in a red dress that commanded attention, him in a tuxedo he'd rather have traded for jeans. She'd been working in pharmaceutical sales, ambitious and magnetic. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Engagement in 6 months, marriage in a year. Perfect, everyone said. Too perfect, perhaps. The children came quickly. Gabriel at 9, Sophie at 7, the twins Emma and Noah at 5. For beautiful kids who had Marshall's eyes, or so everyone claimed. He'd thrown himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to business. Little league coaching, ballet recitals, bedtime stories, family dinners no matter how late the workday ran. His own father had been distant. Marshall was determined to be different. But lately, something felt wrong. Small things, initially. Carrie's phone always face down. Lance's odd smirks during family dinners. Whispered conversations that stopped when Marshall entered rooms. He dismissed it as paranoia, stress from the upcoming Riverside Tower project, his most ambitious development yet, a mixed-use complex that would redefine downtown Portland. Then came last Tuesday. Marshall had returned home early, hoping to surprise Carrie for their anniversary. His Mercedes purred into the circular driveway at 3 p.m. instead of his usual 7. The house stood silent, his family likely at the kids' swimming lessons. He'd planned to set up candles, order from that Italian place she loved, be romantic for once instead of perpetually exhausted. He'd been heading to the wine cellar when he heard voices drifting from the entertainment room. The door was cracked, and he recognized Carrie's laugh, that particular pitch she used with her sister, Brenda Lowe, during their marathon phone calls. "I'm telling you, Brenda, I've got this down to a science," Carrie was saying, her voice carrying that smug satisfaction Marshall had noticed more frequently. "He's such a good father. Works himself to death for those 4 kids. None of them are his. His brother helped fake it all." Marshall's hand froze on the banister. "All 4. Brenda's voice crackled through speakerphone, shocked but impressed. "Jesus, Carrie. That's strategic," Carrie interrupted. "Lance and I have been together since before Marshall and I got engaged. The man works 16-hour days, travels constantly for projects. You think he noticed when I got pregnant right after those girls' weekends? Or when Lance would watch the kids while Marshall was in Seattle?" The world tilted. "But why marry Marshall at all?" Brenda asked. "If you wanted Lance." "Lance?" Carrie laughed, sharp and cruel. "Lance is fun, Brenda. He's exciting. But Marshall has the money, the stability, the reputation. Lance gives me passion. Marshall gives me everything else. Best of both worlds, and neither one knows they're sharing." Marshall stood frozen, his entire reality fracturing. 10 years. For children. His brother. What about DNA tests? Brenda pressed. "Didn't the hospital?" Lance works for the lab that processes the hospital's paternity confirmations. Or did, before Marshall fired him from that job too. Easy enough to switch a few samples. Marshall's so goddamn trusting. He never questioned anything. Just signed whatever the doctors put in front of him. 7 minutes. Marshall stood there for 7 minutes, listening to his wife detail a decade of betrayal with the casual tone someone might use discussing gardening. She talked about the kid's actual father with crude fondness, about Marshall with contemptuous dismissal. About the prenup he'd never thought to get because, "We're in love, we don't need legal protection." About how she'd inherit everything when his stress finally killed him. He backed away silently, his construction train movements making no sound on the hardwood floors. In his home office, he sat in the leather chair, a Christmas gift from the kids 3 years ago, and stared at the family photo on his desk. Gabriel with his baseball glove. Sophie holding her first-place science fair ribbon. The twins covered in frosting from their birthday cake. All of them looking at him with love and trust. None of them his. For the first time in 20 years, Marshall Crane allowed himself to cry. Then he dried his eyes, opened his laptop, and began making lists. Marshall Crane built things that lasted. It was time to build something new. The complete destruction of everyone who'd betrayed him. Chapter 2. Verification and Planning. Marshall spent the next 72 hours becoming someone else. Not visibly, he showed up to sites, reviewed blueprints, kissed Carrie goodbye each morning with the same distracted affection as always. But internally, the man who'd prioritized family above all else died in that moment on the stairs. What remained was something colder, sharper. First, verification. He couldn't act on overhead accusations alone, no matter how convincing. Through a colleague in Seattle, Marshall contacted a private investigation firm with no Portland connections. Douglas McDermott, the lead investigator, was a former FBI agent who specialized in family law cases. "I need complete discretion," Marshall told him during their encrypted video call. "And I need to know if I'm paranoid or if my entire life is a lie." McDermott didn't waste time with platitudes. "I'll need hair samples from the children, recent photos, access to medical records if possible, timeline of your marriage, business trips, any periods of extended absence. This stays between us. Results in 1 week." Marshall provided everything. Hair from the kids' brushes, carefully collected and labeled. Photographs. A detailed calendar reconstruction of the past decade, every business trip, every conference, every time he'd been away from home overnight. Looking at it objectively, he'd been gone roughly 40% of the time. More than enough opportunity. The medical records were trickier, but Marshall remembered Carrie mentioning her doctor, Laura Davenport, had moved to a practice in Eugene last year. He drove 3 hours south, paid cash for a consultation under an assumed name, and during the appointment, casually asked about transferring his family's records. The receptionist, helpful and overworked, pulled up the Crane family files on her screen while explaining the transfer process. Marshall's phone camera, angled carefully in his lap, captured everything, including the notation on all 4 birth records. Paternity confirmation via Lance Crane's sample match, processed by Heritage Labs. Lance had actually put his name in the records. The arrogance was breathtaking. The DNA results arrived 6 days later via encrypted email. McDermott had been thorough. Comparative analysis, chain of custody documentation, results from 2 independent laboratories to eliminate any possibility of error. Zero biological relationship between Marshall Crane and Gabriel, Sophie, Emma, or Noah Crane. Genetic markers consistent with same father across all 4 children. Suggest comparison with brother Lance Crane for definitive confirmation. Marshall stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then he forwarded everything to a secure cloud storage with redundant backups. Evidence secured. Next came financial reconnaissance. Marshall had always maintained transparency in his marriage, joint accounts, full disclosure of business dealings. Carrie had power of attorney for family matters, signatures on secondary accounts, emergency access to everything. She'd insisted on it years ago, framing it as partnership and trust. Now he understood it was invasion. He started with the obvious. Their joint checking account showed regular transfers to an account he didn't recognize. $5,000 monthly, marked as household expenses. Following the digital trail led to an LLC registered in Lance's name, Cascade Ventures. The company existed solely to receive and redistribute Carrie's siphoned funds. $15,000 total over the past 3 years. Not enough to notice against millions in annual revenue, but enough to fund Lance's lifestyle. His brother wasn't just cuckolding him. He was living off Marshall's money while doing it. Marshall dug deeper. Crane Development's financial systems required his biometric authorization, but the household accounts, investments, and trusts were more accessible. He discovered Carrie had taken loans against their home equity, $400, $000 total, dispersed to various accounts. She'd forged his signature using the power of attorney. The money had funded a condo Lance was renting downtown. The same condo, Marshall confirmed via property records, that Carrie visited 3 times weekly during yoga class. The rage that consumed him was cold, methodical. This wasn't passionate anger. It was the fury of a builder discovering someone had been stealing from his foundation for years, waiting for the structure to collapse. He needed counsel, but carefully. His attorney, Patrick Key, had handled Crane Development's legal matters for 15 years. Smart, discreet, ruthlessly pragmatic. Marshall called him after midnight from a burner phone. "Patrick, I need advice that never happened." "I'm listening." Marshall outlined everything. Patrick didn't interrupt, didn't gasp, didn't offer sympathy. When Marshall finished, there was silence. Then, "Jesus Christ. Marshall, you need a divorce attorney. I can recommend." "No divorce." "Not yet." "Then what?" "I need to know my options. What am I legally entitled to? What can I take? What can I protect?" Patrick's keyboard clicked. Oregon is an equitable distribution state. Courts divide assets fairly, but not necessarily equally. With infidelity proven, especially this egregious and prolonged, you'd likely get favorable terms. But Carrie could still claim spousal support. The kids, regardless of biology, you've been their legal father. Child support would apply unless you challenge paternity, which could take years and get ugly. So she'd get paid for cuckolding me. The law doesn't care about fairness, Marshall. It cares about procedure. You're looking at 2-3 years of litigation minimum. Public, expensive, emotionally devastating. And even if you win completely, you might lose half of everything you built. Marshall had expected this. What if the assets didn't exist to divide? Silence. Explain. Hypothetically, if someone liquidated their holdings before filing for divorce. Marshall, that's fraudulent conveyance. Courts can reverse transactions made with intent to avoid marital property division. You'd be caught immediately. Even if the liquidation was legitimate, business decisions, investments, restructuring. Patrick's voice sharpened with understanding. You're thinking of moving assets before she knows you know. Hypothetically, it would need to be explainable as legitimate business activity. Selling properties, restructuring holdings, international investments, all normal for your company. But timing matters. If you file for divorce immediately after, judges aren't stupid. What if I didn't file? What if I just left? Another pause. Abandonment complicates things legally, but it doesn't protect assets already in her name or jointly held. You'd need to. Patrick stopped. This conversation is getting into territory I can't ethically advise on. I understand. Thank you for the hypothetical discussion. Marshall, Patrick's voice softened fractionally. Whatever you're planning, be smarter than your anger. Don't let them destroy what you built. Marshall hung up and opened a new document on his encrypted laptop. At the top, he typed, Project Exodus, Timeline and Execution. The plan took shape over the next month. Marshall had built his fortune through meticulous planning and flawless execution. This would be no different, except the construction project was his own liberation. Phase 1, Documentation. He compiled everything, DNA results, financial fraud evidence, photographs, videos, audio recordings. He set up dead man switches. If he didn't check in weekly, encrypted files would automatically send to federal authorities, the IRS, and a dozen media outlets. Insurance against retaliation. Phase 2, Asset Protection. Crane Development owned 37 properties across Oregon and Washington. Marshall began quiet negotiations to sell 18 of them, citing market timing and portfolio optimization. He restructured the company's holdings, moving personal assets into offshore trusts that were legal but complex. His wealth became fluid, mobile, untouchable. Phase 3, Liquidation. This required finesse. He sold his share of Crane Development to a consortium led by his CFO, Clark Hoyt, who'd been wanting to buy in for years. The sale was legitimate, above board, and netted Marshall $43 million. He rolled the funds through carefully structured international investments, Singapore, Switzerland, the Cayman Islands. Not hidden, just impossible to freeze quickly. Phase 4, The Reveal. This required perfect timing and maximum impact. Christmas Eve, he decided. The perfect symbolism, a holiday built on family and love, destroyed by truth. He planned meticulously, each element designed for devastation. All the while, he maintained the facade. He coached Gabriel's basketball team. He attended Sophie's violin recital. He built snowmen with the twins, read bedtime stories, played the devoted father to children who would never know he'd learned the truth. It was the hardest acting job of his life. Carrie noticed nothing. Neither did Lance, who still showed up for family dinners, still slapped Marshall's back while making jokes, still looked at Carrie with barely concealed hunger when he thought no one noticed. Marshall noticed everything now. The Friday before Christmas, Marshall completed the final transfer. His liquid assets totaled $67 million, distributed across accounts that couldn't be touched without his biometric authentication. His properties were sold. His business was gone. His life in Portland had been systematically dismantled. What remained was the performance. Chapter 3: Christmas Eve Revelation. The Crane family Christmas Eve had always been sacred. No matter how demanding work became, Marshall ensured this night remained perfect. Hand-selected Douglas fir tree, antique ornaments passed down from his grandmother, Carrie's traditional Cioppino dinner, midnight mass at St. Mary's Cathedral, gifts opened by candlelight. This year would be no different. Except for everything. Marshall arrived home at 4 p.m., arms loaded with wrapped presents. The final performance of a father's love. Gabriel, Sophie, Emma, and Noah swarmed him immediately, excited voices overlapping as they detailed their day. He hugged each one, memorizing the moment. Whatever happened after tonight, these children would hate him. That was the price of truth. Carrie emerged from the kitchen, wearing the green cashmere sweater he'd bought her last year. She kissed his cheek, the casual intimacy of a decade together. "You're late. I was worried." Final site inspection, he lied smoothly. In reality, he'd been at a storage facility, loading the last boxes into a climate-controlled unit registered under a shell company. Every document, every photograph, every memory he wanted to preserve, secured and separate from the life he was about to destroy. Lance arrived at 5, carrying wine and wearing his practiced smile. "Big bro, Merry Christmas." The hug felt like acid on Marshall's skin. Dinner was perfect. Carrie had outdone herself with the Cioppino, the sourdough bread, the Caesar salad. The kids chattered about school, friends, presents they hoped to find. Lance told jokes, poured wine, played the beloved uncle. Marshall played along, laughing at appropriate moments, adding to conversations, pretending his world wasn't about to explode. At 8 p.m., they gathered around the tree. Stockings first, then the larger gifts. Marshall watched his family. No, Carrie's family, Lance's family, tear into wrapping paper with childlike joy. He'd bought thoughtfully. Gabriel's signed basketball from his favorite Trailblazers player, Sophie's professional violin bow she'd been coveting, robotics kits for the twins. For Carrie, a diamond bracelet worth $30,000. She gasped appropriately, kissed him with manufactured passion. For Lance, a Rolex. His brother's eyes widened. "Marshall, this is too much." "Family," Marshall said simply. The word tasted like poison. At 9:30, Marshall excused himself to his office, claiming he needed to send a time-sensitive email to investors in Singapore. No one questioned it. Carrie was already organizing the kids' new toys. Lance helping with wine-loosened enthusiasm. In his office, Marshall removed a manila envelope from his desk's hidden compartment. Inside, 4 DNA test results, printed on official laboratory letterhead. Financial records documenting Carrie's fraud. Photographs of Lance and Carrie entering the downtown condo, time-stamped and dated across 3 years. Medical records showing Lance's name on paternity confirmations. And 4 sealed envelopes, each addressed to one of the children. Letters he'd written and rewritten dozens of times, explaining everything in age-appropriate language. Telling them he loved them despite the lies. Encouraging them to seek truth. Leaving trust fund information that couldn't be touched until they turned 18. Money he'd hidden offshore, protected from Carrie's reach. He arranged everything on his desk like a museum exhibition. Then he retrieved the final piece. A framed photograph of his parents' 50th wedding anniversary, 5 years before his father's death. Harold Crane, face weathered but honest, arm around his wife of 5 decades. A marriage built on fidelity and trust. Everything Marshall thought he'd had. He placed the photo atop the documents, centered perfectly. Then he turned on the desk lamp, ensuring the display was clearly visible. At 10:15, He returned to the living room. Carrie was reading "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" to the twins, her voice soft and maternal. Gabriel and Sophie were building a complex Lego set together. Lance lounged on the couch, scrolling his phone. The perfect family tableau. "Carrie, Lance, can you come to my office for a moment? There's something I need to show you both." Carrie looked up, mildly annoyed at the interruption. "Can it wait? We're about to head to church." "No," Marshall said quietly. "It can't." Something in his tone made her pause. Lance glanced up, sensing shift. They exchanged a look, so brief most people would miss it, but Marshall had been watching for weeks. The look of co-conspirators. "Kids, stay here," Marshall instructed. "Watch a movie. We'll leave for church in 20 minutes. He led Carrie and Lance down the hallway, their footsteps echoing on hardwood. His office door stood open, the desk lamp illuminating the arranged evidence like a spotlight. Carrie entered first. She saw the documents and stopped so suddenly Lance bumped into her. "Marshall, what?" "Don't," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Don't insult me with questions. Just read." Lance's face drained of color as he recognized the DNA results. Carrie's hands trembled as she picked up the financial records, her eyes scanning the highlighted sections showing her fraud. "Let me explain," she started, but Marshall raised his hand. "I heard you explain. 3 weeks ago. You were on speakerphone with your sister, remember? Discussing how none of your 4 children are mine. How Lance helped fake the paternity tests. How I'm such a good father to kids that aren't mine. How you've been stealing from me for years. How you're waiting for stress to kill me so you can inherit everything." The words hung in the air like executioner's blades. Lance found his voice first. "Marsh, listen." 7 years, Marshall continued, ignoring him. "That's how long Lance has been living in my guest house. 5 of those years, he's been sleeping with my wife. Fathering children I believed were mine. Stealing my money. Laughing at me behind my back." Carrie's face cycled through emotions, shock, fear, calculation. She landed on tears. "Marshall, please, I can explain. It was a mistake. 4 children aren't a mistake. A decade of systematic fraud isn't a mistake. This," he gestured at the evidence, "is deliberate, calculated betrayal." Lance tried a different approach. "You're my brother. We can work through. I have no brother." Marshall's voice could have frozen steel. Harold Crane had 2 sons. One built something meaningful. The other proved himself a parasite. "You're no family of mine." He pulled out his phone, loading a video file. "I've documented everything. Every lie, every theft, every moment of your affair. This evidence has been copied to federal authorities, the IRS, and family court. By morning, you'll both be under investigation for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy." Carrie's tears evaporated. "You wouldn't. The scandal would destroy you too." "I don't care." Marshall's smile was cold. "I've already sold Crane Development. Liquidated my properties. Moved my assets beyond your reach. As of 3 hours ago, I own nothing in Oregon. No business, no house, no attachments." "That's illegal," Lance sputtered. "Fraudulent conveyance is only fraud if done to avoid legal obligations," Marshall corrected. "I haven't filed for divorce. Haven't been sued. These were legitimate business decisions, all documented and legal. By the time you figure out how to challenge them, the statute of limitations will have expired." He watched understanding dawn on their faces. This wasn't rage. It was chess, and Marshall had been planning 12 moves ahead while they were still celebrating their perceived victory. "The children," Carrie said desperately. "You can't just abandon. Those children deserve to know their real father," Marshall interrupted. "Congratulations, Lance. You're about to become a single dad to 4 kids. Their trust funds are secured offshore. They'll get that money when they're 18, whether you like it or not. But raising them, paying for their food, education, healthcare, that's on you now." "You son of a bitch," Lance breathed. "No," Marshall said softly. "I'm Harold Crane's son. You're just a stranger who shares my last name." He picked up a backpack from behind his desk, already packed with essentials. "I'm leaving tonight. Don't look for me. Don't contact me. If you try, those evidence files go public immediately. The IRS will tear apart every financial transaction you've made in a decade. Child Services will investigate your fitness as parents. Your names will be synonymous with fraud and betrayal. Where will you go?" Carrie's voice was small now, the confident woman from 3 weeks ago completely gone. "Somewhere you'll never find me." Marshall moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and the house. Sold it yesterday to a development firm. You have 60 days to vacate. Merry Christmas. He walked past them, down the hallway where his children's laughter echoed from the living room. He stopped at the doorway, looking at Gabriel, Sophie, Emma, and Noah one final time. They were beautiful children. They deserved better than the parents they'd been born to. The letters on his desk would explain everything when they were old enough to understand. Marshall grabbed his coat from the hall closet and walked out into the December night. Snow was falling softly, blanketing Portland in white. His Mercedes was packed with a single suitcase. Everything else he needed was digital, portable, untouchable. Behind him, he heard Carrie's scream of rage. Lance is shouting. The sounds of his old life imploding. Marshall Crane started the engine and drove away from Lake Oswego, from Portland, from Oregon. He had $67 million, no attachments, and 7 years' worth of rage fueling his next chapter. He'd built an empire once. He'd build another, bigger, better, and when he returned, everyone who'd betrayed him would understand the true meaning of consequences. The snow fell heavier as he merged onto I-5 South, disappearing into the darkness. Chapter 4, The Wilderness Years. Marshall drove through the night, crossing into California as dawn broke over Mount Shasta. He ditched his Mercedes in Sacramento, too traceable, too connected to his old life. He paid cash for a used Toyota Camry from a dealership that didn't ask questions, transferred his essential documents, and continued south. Los Angeles first, but only briefly. The tech scene there was too connected to Portland. Instead, he headed to San Diego, then across the border to Mexico, Tijuana, then deeper into Baja California, finally settling temporarily in a small coastal town where Americans were common enough not to attract attention. For 3 months, Marshall did nothing. He rented a modest apartment overlooking the Pacific, paid cash for everything, and let the rage burn itself out. He grew a beard, cut his hair short, stopped wearing the designer clothes that had defined his Portland life. He looked like any other expatriate escaping something, which, he supposed, he was. At night, he monitored the fallout through encrypted channels. Douglas McDermott, the investigator who'd confirmed the DNA results, provided updates for a generous fee. The IRS had indeed opened investigations into both Carrie and Lance. The financial fraud Marshall documented was too egregious to ignore. Carrie's forgeries on the home equity loans alone constituted multiple felonies. Lance's involvement in falsifying paternity tests had cost him his laboratory license and triggered a criminal investigation. The Portland media picked up the story. Prominent developer vanishes, leaves family in financial ruin. The narrative painted Marshall as either victim or villain, depending on the outlet. Some praised his escape from a decade of betrayal. Others condemned his abandonment of the children. Marshall didn't care. Public opinion was meaningless compared to results. Carrie had hired an attorney, Patrick Key, ironically, Marshall's former counsel. Patrick was good enough to delay the IRS proceedings, but not good enough to make them disappear. The investigation ground forward with bureaucratic inevitability. Lance had simply fallen apart. Without Marshall's money, without prospects, facing criminal charges, he descended into alcoholism. McDermott's reports included photographs. Lance leaving dive bars at 2 a.m., Lance arguing with Carrie outside courthouses, Lance looking 20 years older than his 32 years. The children were collateral damage. Gabriel had been pulled from private school, tuition unpaid. Sophie's violin lessons ended. The twins lost their nanny. Carrie struggled with 4 kids she'd never actually raised alone, her pharmaceutical sales career torpedoed by the scandal. Marshall felt nothing reading these updates. He'd cauterized that part of himself on Christmas Eve. In month 4, Marshall emerged from his grief cocoon with clarity. Revenge through destruction was satisfying but finite. True revenge required building something so spectacular that his enemies would watch from the gutter while he ascended to heights they couldn't imagine. He began researching. Technology was obvious, the sector with the fastest wealth creation. But Marshall knew construction, real estate, development. He needed something that combined both. The answer came from an unlikely source. A conversation with an MIT professor he'd funded years ago through a Crane Development charitable donation. Dr. Grant Burns was developing advanced materials for sustainable construction, self-healing concrete, transparent aluminum composites, carbon-negative building materials. revolutionary concepts that were years from commercial viability. Unless someone with Marshall's development expertise and newly liquid capital accelerated the timeline. Marshall flew to Boston under a new identity. He'd acquired legitimate documents through connections in Mexico, nothing illegal, just complex. He met Dr. Burns in a Cambridge coffee shop and made his pitch: full funding for the research, patent rights to be shared, and Marshall's development expertise to commercialize whatever they created. Burns, perpetually broke from chasing grants, agreed immediately. They relocated to Singapore, neutral territory with advantageous tax laws and proximity to Asian manufacturing. Marshall invested $15 million into a company they called Titan Materials. The name was deliberate. Mythological beings who'd overthrown the gods. Fitting. The first 2 years were brutal. Research moved slowly. Prototypes failed. Investors Marshall courted politely declined. He burned through 30 million learning lessons that would have destroyed most entrepreneurs. But Marshall had learned patience building crane development. He'd learned precision. And he'd learned that true success required obsessive attention to detail. In year 3, Dr. Burns achieved a breakthrough. A concrete composite that was 40% stronger than traditional materials, self-repairing through embedded bacteria that generated limestone when cracks appeared, and carbon negative through captured atmospheric CO2. The construction applications were staggering. Marshall immediately pivoted to commercialization. He licensed the technology to small firms first, building proof-of-concept projects across Southeast Asia. A school in Vietnam. An apartment complex in Thailand. Each project demonstrated Titan Materials' superiority while generating revenue and credibility. Year 4 brought the major players. An Australian mining company needed infrastructure that could survive extreme conditions. Titan Materials provided the solution. A Dubai developer wanted to build the world's most sustainable skyscraper. Titan Materials made it possible. The patents Marshall and Dr. Burns held became increasingly valuable. Marshall negotiated ruthlessly, trading limited licenses for equity stakes in the companies using his materials. He wasn't just selling products. He was building an empire of connected interests. By year 5, Titan Materials was valued at $200 million. Marshall owned 60%. He'd quintupled his initial wealth. But he wasn't done. Marshall had been watching Portland from afar. The city had continued developing, but slower, less confidently. Crane development, under Clark Hoyt's leadership, had remained profitable but unspectacular. The spark was gone. The vision that Marshall brought was irreplaceable. More importantly, Marshall had been waiting for the perfect opportunity. It came in the form of the Columbia River Waterfront Renewal Project, a massive public-private partnership to redevelop 3 miles of riverfront into mixed-use space. The contract would be worth billions, define Portland's growth for the next 2 decades, and cement whoever won it as the dominant developer in the Pacific Northwest. Marshall wanted that contract. Not for the money. He had plenty. For the statement. In year 6, he began positioning. He created a new entity, Apex Development Group, registered in Delaware, capitalized with offshore funds, and deliberately opaque. He hired the best architects from London, engineers from Germany, sustainability consultants from Scandinavia. He built a team that existed solely to win the Columbia River contract. The proposal Apex submitted was breathtaking, a carbon-neutral development using Titan Materials, incorporating public parks, affordable housing, commercial space, and cultural centers. The designs looked like they belonged in a sci-fi film. The financial projections were conservative but compelling. The sustainability metrics exceeded every requirement. Most importantly, Marshall had learned his competitors' weaknesses. He'd spent 6 years studying Portland's development scene from afar. He knew which firms cut corners, which ones had political connections, which ones would submit flashy but ultimately unworkable proposals. Apex's submission was engineered to win. In month 73 of his exile, Marshall received confirmation Apex Development Group had been shortlisted as one of 3 finalists. Final presentations would be held in Portland in 6 weeks. It was time to go home, but not as the man who'd left. Marshall had spent 7 years transforming himself. The beard was gone, replaced by tailored perfection. He'd lost 30 pounds through disciplined training. He dressed like wealth incarnate. Bespoke suits from Savile Row, watches worth more than cars, the quiet confidence of someone who'd rebuilt from ashes. Most importantly, his net worth now exceeded $1 billion. Titan Materials. Equity stakes in 30 companies across 5 continents. Real estate holdings from Singapore to London. Investments that printed money while he slept. Marshall Crane had left Portland worth $67 million and broken. He was returning worth 10 times that and unbreakable. The final piece fell into place when McDermott sent his last report. Carey had been convicted of bank fraud and sentenced to 4 years federal prison. Lance had taken a plea deal, 3 years probation, community service, permanent ban from any medical laboratory work. The children were in state custody, caught in foster care, while family services tried to locate suitable relatives. Marshall felt that same cold satisfaction from Christmas Eve. He'd promised consequences. He'd delivered. Now came the second act, showing everyone who doubted him, betrayed him, or dismissed him exactly what he'd become. He booked a first-class flight to Portland for the week before the final presentation. Not under Marshall Crane. That name still carried baggage. Under his new identity, Marshall Titan, CEO of Apex Development Group. 7 years. 7 years of exile, of building, of waiting. The wilderness period was over. It was time for reckoning. Chapter 5. The Return. Marshall's private jet touched down at Portland International at 3 p.m. on a gray October afternoon. 7 years since he'd driven away in snow. Now rain hammered the tarmac with familiar insistence. Oregon hadn't changed, but Marshall had. A black Mercedes S-Class waited on the tarmac, rental, paid through Apex Development. Marshall slid into the back seat, instructing the driver toward downtown. As they crossed the Willamette River, he studied the skyline with developer's eyes. The riverside tower he'd been planning when his life exploded had been completed by someone else, poorly. The facade work was shoddy, the proportions wrong. His building would have been beautiful. This was merely functional. The city looked smaller than he remembered. Or perhaps he'd simply outgrown it. The driver pulled up to the Heathman Hotel, Portland's historic luxury property. Marshall checked in as Marshall Titan, presenting credentials that were both new and legally sound. The suite was predictably perfect, 19th floor corner room overlooking Pioneer Square. He had 4 days before the Columbia River presentation. 4 days to remind Portland what it had lost. The next morning, Marshall scheduled breakfast with Isabel Walls, the city councilwoman who chaired the development committee. She'd been a marginal player 7 years ago. Now she wielded significant power over which project got approved. They met at a downtown bistro. Isabel arrived precisely on time, a woman in her 50s who'd built political capital through competence rather than charisma. She shook Marshall's hand with a grip that meant business. Mr. Titan, thank you for making time. Your proposal has generated significant excitement. Portland's a city with vision, Marshall said smoothly. Apex wants to be part of that future. They discussed sustainability metrics, economic projections, community impact. Isabel was sharp, asking questions that revealed both intelligence and skepticism. Marshall appreciated it. This was someone who cared about results, not politics. Halfway through the meeting, she paused. Forgive me, but there's something familiar about you. Have we met before? Marshall had anticipated this. 7 years older, 30 pounds lighter, different styling. He looked related to his former self, but not identical. I worked in Portland briefly years ago. Different industry. Small world. Isabel nodded, satisfied, and they continued. By the end of breakfast, Marshall could tell she was leaning toward Apex. The proposal was simply too strong, too aligned with Portland's stated priorities. One down. That afternoon, Marshall visited his old haunts. Not sentimentally, strategically. He drove past the Crane development offices, now rebranded and clearly struggling based on the lack of activity. He cruised through Lake Oswego, past the house he'd sold 7 years ago. New owners had painted it gray. He felt nothing. He did, however, drive past the property where Lance's condo had been, the place where Carey had spent years lying to him. The building had been converted to offices. Appropriate, somehow. Marshall's phone buzzed. Douglas McDermott, the investigator who'd helped him disappear, had sent a message. She's out. Early release for good behavior. Thought you should know. Carey, released from federal prison 6 months ahead of schedule. Marshall absorbed this information without emotion. Her freedom changed nothing. She was irrelevant to his plans. Although, an idea began forming. That evening, Marshall attended a development industry mixer at a Pearl District gallery. These events had always been performative, networking disguised as culture appreciation. But they served their purpose. He recognized faces immediately. Clark Hoyt, who'd bought Crane Development, looking grayer and more tired. Developers he'd competed with, some successful, most treading water. Architects, engineers, city officials, all circulating through the crowd with wine glasses and business cards. Marshall entered like he owned the room, which, given his net worth compared to anyone else present, he effectively did. Clark Hoyt noticed him first. They'd never met in person. Marshall had handled the Crane Development sale entirely through intermediaries. Clark approached with hand extended. Marshall Titan? Clark Hoyt, Oregon Development Group. Your Apex proposal is impressive. Going to make the rest of us work hard. Marshall shook his hand, searching Clark's face for recognition. Nothing. 7 years and physical transformation had created someone new. Competition drives excellence. I'm sure your proposal has merits. We're focusing on affordability, Clark said, launching into his pitch. Marshall listened politely, already knowing every detail. He'd obtained Clark's proposal 3 weeks ago through perfectly legal channels. Public records requests, leaked documents from industry contacts. Clark's plan was competent but uninspired. It would work, but it wouldn't transform anything. Apex would destroy it. As Clark talked, Marshall spotted someone across the room who made his pulse spike for the first time in years. Lance. His brother looked like a ghost of his former self. Gaunt where he'd been athletic, with the hollow eyes and broken posture of someone thoroughly defeated. He was talking to a woman Marshall didn't recognize, gesturing with nervous energy that screamed desperation. Marshall excused himself from Clark and moved closer, predators circling prey. Lance was pitching something, a development consultancy, from what Marshall could overhear, trying to rebuild credibility in an industry that had thoroughly blacklisted him. The woman looked politely uninterested, already scanning for escape routes. Marshall waited until she'd made excuses and left, then approached. Tough crowd for networking. Lance turned, and Marshall saw his brother truly for the first time in 7 years. The resemblance to their father was still there, but corroded by failure and consequence. Yeah, well, reputation matters in this business. Hard to rebuild when you've... Lance stopped, really looking at Marshall. Do I know you? I don't think so. Marshall Titan, Apex Development. Lance's eyes narrowed. Titan? As in Titan Materials? That's your company. One of them. Something flickered across Lance's face. Confusion, suspicion, then dismissal. The idea that his brother, the man he'd betrayed, could have transformed this dramatically was too improbable to consider. I'm Lance Crane, he said, extending his hand. Used to work in development. Looking to get back in. Marshall shook the hand that had cuckolded him, feeling nothing. Crane? Any relation to Marshall Crane? I heard he used to run a firm here. Lance's face darkened. My brother. He left town years ago, after some personal issues. Shame. I've heard he was talented. He was all right, Lance said bitterly. Got lucky early, wrote his father's name. But yeah, personal issues caught up with him. The lies came easily. Lance still couldn't accept responsibility. Marshall smiled. Well, good luck rebuilding. Industry's always got room for talent. He walked away before Lance could respond, adrenaline singing through his veins. 7 years, and his brother still blamed him for the consequences of betrayal. Still cast himself as the victim. Perfect. That would make the final reckoning so much sweeter. The next 3 days were a ballet of strategic positioning. Marshall met with every committee member individually, tailoring his pitch to their specific concerns. He took the mayor to lunch at the best restaurant in Portland, one he'd reserved entirely for their private meeting. He donated $500,000 to the mayor's preferred charity through Apex's foundation. He also did his homework. He learned that Carrie was working at a chain pharmacy in Beaverton, barely scraping by on minimum wage. The children were still in foster care. Bureaucratic nightmares had prevented Lance from gaining custody despite being their biological father. The irony was sharp. The children he'd wanted were now legally orphaned, and the system wouldn't let him parent them. Marshall could have intervened. His resources could have expedited their placement with family. But he didn't. Those children deserved better than Lance and Carrie. The foster system, for all its flaws, might give them a chance at stability he could never provide. On the morning of the presentation, Marshall dressed with the precision of armor. Tom Ford suit, Hermes tie, Patek Philippe watch. He looked like wealth incarnate because he was. The presentation venue was the Portland Development Commission's headquarters, a converted warehouse in the Pearl District. 3 firms were presenting. Hoyt's Oregon Development Group, a California consortium called Pacific Ventures, and Apex. Marshall arrived last, flanked by his team, the architects from London, the lead engineer from Titan Materials, his CFO from Singapore. They looked like an invasion force, which was precisely the image Marshall wanted to project. The presentations went in alphabetical order, Apex last. Hoyt's team went first. Competent, thorough, boring. They emphasized local connections, affordable housing, job creation. The commissioners nodded politely, asked standard questions. It was a proposal designed not to offend anyone, and therefore not to inspire anyone. Pacific Ventures presented second. Flashy, expensive, impressive aesthetically, but weak on sustainability and community impact. They were clearly accustomed to winning through spectacle. The commissioners looked more engaged, but also skeptical. This was Portland. Substance mattered more than style. Then came Apex. Marshall took the podium, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt completely himself. This was his element. This was what he'd been building toward. Commissioners, mayor, members of the public, thank you for this opportunity. 7 years ago, I left a city I loved because staying was impossible. I built something new elsewhere, something revolutionary. Today, I'm offering Portland the chance to be part of that revolution. He clicked to the first slide, a rendering of the Columbia River development that looked like it belonged in 2050. Sleek, sustainable, alive with greenery and light. Apex Development isn't just proposing buildings. We're proposing a new standard for urban development. Using Titan Materials, technology we pioneered, we can create structures that are carbon negative, self-repairing, and designed to last centuries rather than decades. For 45 minutes, Marshall detailed a vision that was audacious, specific, and achievable. He showed financial models demonstrating profitability without sacrificing community benefits. He presented letters of intent from major tenants. He outlined job creation numbers that dwarfed competitors. Most importantly, he showed passion. This wasn't a contract to him. It was a statement. Portland could choose mediocrity with Hoyt or Flash with Pacific Ventures, or it could choose transformation with Apex. The commissioners peppered him with questions. Marshall answered each one with precision and confidence. This was his domain. This was what he'd spent 7 years preparing for. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Isabel Walls began clapping. Others joined, and suddenly the entire commission was applauding. Marshall had won. He could feel it. The official decision would come in 3 weeks, but Marshall knew how these things worked. Barring catastrophe, Apex Development had just secured the future of Portland's waterfront. He'd returned to the city that had failed to see his worth and proven he'd outgrown it entirely. That evening, Marshall celebrated alone in his hotel suite, drinking whiskey older than his betrayal. Tomorrow, he'd begin the final phase, making sure everyone who'd wronged him understood exactly what they'd lost. But tonight, he simply savored victory. 7 years. 7 years of building in exile. And now, the return was complete. Chapter 6. Confrontations. The official announcement came 2 weeks later. Apex Development Group had won the Columbia River contract. The vote was unanimous. Marshall received the news in his Singapore office, 8,436 miles from Portland, and allowed himself a rare smile. The announcement made headlines across Portland. Mystery developer wins waterfront contract. Apex's billion-dollar vision for Columbia River. New player reshapes Portland development. The articles detailed Apex's proposal, Marshall Titan's impressive but vague background, and speculation about what this meant for Portland's future. None of them connected Marshall Titan to Marshall Crane. 7 years and deliberate reinvention had created someone new. But Marshall wasn't done. The contract was the statement. What came next was the reckoning. He flew back to Portland 3 days after the announcement, this time not as a visitor, but as someone claiming territory. He'd purchased a penthouse in the Pearl District, not to live in permanently, but as a base of operations. The symbolism mattered. Marshall Crane had been run out of town. Marshall Titan was building an empire on its bones. His first move was calculated, a press conference announcing Apex's commitment to Portland. He stood before cameras in a downtown hotel ballroom, flanked by city officials who were eager to bask in reflected glory. This project represents more than development, Marshall told the assembled media. It represents a belief that cities can grow sustainably, beautifully, and equitably. Portland has always been a city of vision. Apex is honored to be part of that vision. Questions came rapid fire. Marshall handled them smoothly, pivoting every answer back to Portland's future, Apex's capabilities, the transformative potential of Titan Materials. Then a reporter from the Oregonian asked, "Mr. Titan, there's speculation about your background. Some suggest you have previous connections to Portland. Can you comment?" Marshall met the reporter's eyes. "I've worked in many cities. Portland's no different. What matters isn't where I've been, it's what I'm building next." Non-denial, deliberate and strategic. Let them speculate. Mystery added to his mystique. After the press conference, Marshall attended a reception for major donors and stakeholders. This was where the real work happened. Backroom conversations, alliance building, subtle power plays. He was networking with a tech executive when he felt eyes on him. Turning, he saw Carrie. She stood across the room, wearing a discount dress that probably represented a week's wages from her pharmacy job. She looked older. Federal prison and financial ruin had carved lines into her face. But her eyes were sharp, focused on him with an intensity that bordered on recognition. Marshall excused himself and moved closer. "Might as well get this over with." "Carrie Crane," he said smoothly. "I don't believe we've met." Marshall Titan, Apex Development. Up close, he could see her struggling. She knew this face, knew this voice, but couldn't reconcile the man before her with the husband who'd disappeared 7 years ago. "You look familiar," she said carefully. "Have we?" "I have one of those faces," Marshall interrupted. "I understand you used to be married to Marshall Crane, the developer who left town." Her expression hardened. "Yes, a lifetime ago. Must have been difficult. Man abandoning his family like that." Carrie's jaw tightened. She still didn't recognize him fully, but his questions were too pointed to be coincidence. "It was complicated." "I'm sure," Marshall said. "I heard there were financial irregularities. Fraud investigations. Must have been challenging to rebuild from that." Now he saw fear flickering across her face. "I've paid my debt. Served my time. That's behind me. Of course, I believe in second chances." Marshall smiled, and something in that smile finally triggered recognition. Her eyes went wide. "Marshall," she whispered. "That name's not relevant anymore," he said quietly. "I'm Marshall Titan now. Different man. Different life. But yes, I remember you, Carrie. I remember everything." The blood drained from her face. "Oh my God. No God involved. Just consequences. You and Lance wanted to take everything from me? Well, I built something bigger. I became someone you could never imagine. And now I'm back in the city you thought you'd driven me from, worth more than you could steal in 100 lifetimes." "The children," Carrie started. "Lance's children," Marshall corrected. "Not my problem. You made sure of that with your lies, remember?" Tears started down her cheeks. "Marshall, please. I know what I did was wrong. I've lost everything." "Good," he said simply. "You should have lost more. Federal prison was lenient compared to what you deserved." He turned to walk away, then paused. "Oh, and Carrie, if you tell anyone who I really am, those evidence files I mentioned 7 years ago go public. Your fraud, your affair, everything. I'll destroy whatever's left of your life. Are we clear?" She nodded, unable to speak. Marshall left her there, broken and crying at a party celebrating his triumph. He felt nothing. She'd made her choices. Now she lived with them. 2 days later, Marshall scheduled a meeting he'd been anticipating for weeks. Lunch with Lance. His brother had been calling Apex's offices repeatedly, asking for meetings to discuss consulting opportunities. Marshall's assistant had politely deflected, but finally Marshall told her to schedule something. Time to close this particular circle. They met at a steakhouse Lance had suggested, mid-range, trying too hard. Exactly what Marshall expected. Lance arrived 10 minutes late, looking nervous and rehearsed. "Mr. Titan, thank you for making time. I know you're incredibly busy with the waterfront project. Get to the point, Lance." Lance flinched at the use of his first name, but pressed forward. "I have extensive experience in Portland development. Knowledge of the local market, relationships with contractors, understanding of regulatory processes. I could be valuable to Apex as a consultant." Marshall leaned back, studying his brother with clinical detachment. "You're asking me to hire you." "Not hire exactly. Contract work. Project-specific consulting. I'd be an asset. You'd be a liability, Marshall interrupted. Your reputation in this industry is destroyed. You falsified paternity tests, engaged in fraud, and proved yourself fundamentally dishonest. Why would any company risk association with that? Lance's face reddened. That was years ago. I've paid my price. Have you? Marshall's voice was cold. Because from where I'm sitting, you've paid very little. 3 years probation? Community service? You should have been in federal prison alongside Carrie. You don't understand what it was like, Lance said desperately. After Marshall left. After Marshall discovered a decade of betrayal, Marshall corrected. Let's be accurate about what happened. Lance's eyes narrowed. You talk about him like you knew him. I know enough. I know he built something meaningful that was destroyed by people he trusted. I know he had every right to walk away from that toxicity. He abandoned 4 children. They weren't his children. Marshall's voice rose for the first time, drawing looks from nearby tables. He lowered it again, controlled. That's the part you always forget, Lance. Those were your children. Your biological kids. And you couldn't even step up to raise them because you were too busy blaming everyone else for the consequences of your actions. Lance stared at him, and Marshall saw the moment recognition dawned. His brother's face went through the same transformation Carrie's had. Shock, disbelief, then horrified understanding. No, Lance breathed. You can't be. Can't be what? Marshall smiled without warmth. Can't be the brother you betrayed? Can't be the man you thought you destroyed? Can't be someone who became more successful than you could ever imagine. Marshall, Lance's voice broke. That name doesn't exist anymore. I'm Marshall Titan now. I'm the billionaire developer who just won the biggest contract in Portland's history. I'm the man who left you and your mistress to rot in the consequences of your betrayal while I built an empire. Marshall stood, throwing cash on the table. You wanted my help? Here's my help. Learn to live with what you did. Learn that actions have consequences. Learn that stealing from family, lying for years, and playing the victim doesn't earn you second chances. Please. Lance reached for his arm, but Marshall stepped back. Don't contact me again. Don't approach me. Don't mention my name to anyone. You're nothing to me, Lance. Less than nothing. You're a cautionary tale I tell myself about trusting the wrong people. He walked out, leaving his brother crying in a steakhouse, just as he'd left Carrie crying at the reception. The Crane family was broken beyond repair, and Marshall was the one who'd swung the final hammer. Perfect. That evening, Marshall received an unexpected visitor at his penthouse. The doorman called up. Sir, there's a young man here asking to see you. Says his name is Gabriel Crane. Marshall froze. Gabriel, the oldest of the 4 children. He'd be 16 now, old enough to track down information, old enough to demand answers. Send him up, Marshall said. The boy who stepped into the penthouse looked heartbreakingly familiar. Marshall's height, Lance's features, caught somewhere between childhood and adulthood. He wore jeans and a worn jacket, the carefully maintained appearance of someone trying to look more confident than they felt. Mr. Titan? Gabriel's voice was cautious. Marshall studied the teenager who'd called him dad for 9 years. Gabriel, how did you find me? Mom said something. Then I saw your picture in the news. You look different, but... Gabriel's jaw tightened. You're him, aren't you? You're Marshall Crane. No point in lying. I was. That man doesn't exist anymore. Gabriel nodded slowly, processing. I'm in foster care. Have been for 6 years. Sophie, Emma, Noah, we're all separated. Different homes. The system won't let Lance take us because of his record, and Mom's too unstable since prison. I know, Marshall said. You know? You know we've been bouncing through group homes and shitty foster families, and you've just been, what? Building buildings. The anger in Gabriel's voice was familiar. Marshall had carried the same fury for years. I've been building a life that isn't built on lies, Marshall said carefully. Those 4 children, you included, aren't my biological children. Your mother and Lance made sure of that. So we don't matter? Gabriel's eyes blazed. Because we're not genetically yours, we're just disposable? Marshall felt something crack inside him. This boy, standing in his penthouse with righteous anger, reminded him of who he'd been before betrayal had calcified his heart. You mattered, Marshall said quietly. All of you mattered more than anything. That's why learning the truth destroyed me. Then help us, Gabriel pleaded. You're a billionaire. You could get us out of the system. You could. I can't be your father, Gabriel. That door closed 7 years ago. I'm not asking you to be my dad, Gabriel said. I'm asking you to be the man who gives a shit about 4 kids who got screwed over by the same people who screwed you over. Marshall looked at this boy, this not his son, and saw truth. Gabriel and his siblings were victims too. They hadn't chosen Lance and Carrie. They hadn't asked to be pawns in adult betrayals. I'll think about it, Marshall finally said. Gabriel nodded. That's all I'm asking. Think about it. We deserve better than what we got, just like you did. He left, and Marshall stood in his empty penthouse, staring out at Portland's skyline. He'd gotten his revenge. He'd proven his worth. He'd won everything that mattered. So why did he still feel hollow? Chapter 7. The Trap. Marshall didn't sleep that night. Gabriel's visit had cracked something open, a part of himself he'd thought permanently sealed. Those children weren't his genetically, but he'd raised them for 9 years. He'd taught Gabriel to ride a bike, helped Sophie with math homework, read bedtime stories to the twins. Genetics didn't erase those years. Biology didn't retroactively delete memories. By dawn, Marshall had made a decision. Not forgiveness. He'd never forgive Carrie and Lance. But the children deserved better than being collateral damage in adult wars. He called his attorney first thing. Patrick, I need you to navigate family law. Hypothetically, if someone wanted to help children in foster care without formally adopting them. Trust fund, Patrick said immediately. Educational trusts, specifically. You can establish funds for their education, housing, healthcare. No parental rights required. Just legal documentation showing intent to support. Make it happen. For trusts, $50 million each. Structured so they can't access principal until 18, but guardians can draw for verified education and healthcare expenses. Patrick whistled. $200 million for kids that aren't legally yours. They didn't ask for any of this, Marshall said. They're victims same as me. You've changed, Patrick observed. The Marshall Crane who left Portland wouldn't have done this. Marshall Crane died 7 years ago. I'm just cleaning up his unfinished business. The trust took 3 days to establish. Marshall didn't tell Gabriel directly. Instead, he had the documents delivered to the foster care agency with instructions that the children's guardians be informed. Let them think it was anonymous charity from a wealthy benefactor. Marshall didn't need gratitude. But the trusts were just the opening move. Marshall had bigger plans. The Columbia River project was progressing beautifully. Apex's team had hit the ground running. Preliminary surveys, architectural refinements, contractor negotiations. But Marshall wasn't satisfied with just building. He wanted to make a statement that would reverberate for decades. That statement required destroying the people who'd tried to destroy him. Lance was easy. Marshall used his connections to ensure every development firm in Portland knew about Lance's history. A few well-placed calls to industry leaders, some forwarded articles about the paternity fraud scandal, gentle reminders that Lance Crane represented liability. Within 2 weeks, Lance couldn't get an interview at a third-rate construction company. He was radioactive, untouchable. Marshall watched from afar as his brother's consulting dreams evaporated, leaving him working part-time at a hardware store for minimum wage. Carrie was trickier. She'd already hit rock bottom, federal prison, minimum wage, estranged from her children. Traditional revenge wouldn't work. So Marshall got creative. Through shell companies, he bought the pharmacy chain where Carrie worked. Not the individual store, the entire regional chain, 23 locations. The acquisition was handled through intermediaries, perfectly legal, motivated by legitimate business expansion. Then he began restructuring. Store managers were replaced. Performance standards increased. Employees who couldn't meet the new metrics were terminated. Carrie, with her federal conviction and limited retail experience, didn't survive the first round of cuts. She'd find another minimum wage job eventually. But she'd know, even if she couldn't prove it, that Marshall had engineered her firing. She'd spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, wondering when he'd strike next. But the trusts and the personal revenge were just set up. Marshall's real target was bigger. Clark Hoyt's Oregon Development Group had been struggling since losing the Columbia River contract. The firm wasn't failing, but it wasn't thriving either. Clark had bet heavily on winning that bid, and the loss had rattled investor confidence. Marshall saw opportunity. Through Apex and its subsidiaries, he began a hostile acquisition campaign. First, he poached Oregon Development's best people, architects, engineers, project managers. He offered salaries Clark couldn't match, benefits that were industry-leading, and the prestige of working on the Columbia River project. Within 3 months, Oregon Development had lost 30% of its talent. Next, Marshall targeted their active projects. He identified developments that were financially shaky, offered to buy them at slightly above market value, then restructured them under Apex management. Each acquisition was legal, ethical, and devastating to Clark's firm. Clark tried fighting back. He gave interviews about vulture capitalism and outside developers destroying local businesses. The media picked it up, but Marshall countered brilliantly. Competition is healthy, he told the Portland Business Journal. If Oregon Development can't retain talent or maintain profitable projects, perhaps their business model needs reevaluation. Apex isn't destroying anything. We're raising standards. The PR battle was vicious but one-sided. Marshall had resources Clark couldn't match, media training Clark lacked, and the moral high ground of superior performance. 6 months after winning the Columbia River contract, Marshall made his final move, a formal acquisition offer for Oregon Development Group itself. He offered Clark 20% above market value, generous by any standard, with the caveat that Clark stepped down from leadership but remained as a consultant for 2 years. It was a golden parachute wrapped in humiliation. Clark fought it. He tried finding white knight investors, rallied his board, gave impassioned speeches about independence and local ownership. But his investors had seen Apex's financial projections. They'd watched talent flee. They knew the writing on the wall. The vote was 8-2 in favor of accepting Apex's offer. Oregon Development Group became an Apex subsidiary. Clark Hoyt became a consultant with no real power, forced to watch Marshall Titan run the company he'd built his career on. The irony was delicious. Clark had bought Crane Development from Marshall 7 years ago. Now Marshall, under a new name, had bought Clark's company and relegated him to irrelevance. But Marshall saved his most creative revenge for last. The Columbia River project included a significant public art component: sculptures, murals, installations throughout the development. Marshall worked with the Arts Commission to establish a naming convention for various elements. The Central Plaza, a 3-acre park that would be the development's heart, needed a name. Marshall suggested they honor someone who embodied Portland's values of family, integrity, and commitment. He proposed naming it Harold Crane Memorial Plaza, after his father. The commission loved it. Harold Crane had been a respected businessman, a philanthropist, a man who'd embodied old Portland's best values. The fact that he was Marshall Titan's distant relative, former employer? The connection was vague enough not to trigger questions, but clear enough that anyone who dug would find it. The plaza would open in 2 years. Every day, Lance and Carrie would see their betrayed victim's father's name celebrated across 3 acres of prime Portland real estate. They'd know Marshall had won so completely that the city itself honored his family while they rotted in obscurity. But the naming wasn't even Marshall's favorite detail. The plaza would feature a central sculpture, a family, father, mother, 2 children, in bronze, capturing a moment of joy and connection. The artist was renowned, the design approved unanimously. What the commission didn't know was that Marshall had provided the artist with reference photos, not of any real family, but of the family Marshall should have had. The father figure bore a striking resemblance to Marshall himself. The mother looked nothing like Carrie. The children were generic enough to be any kids. It was a monument to the family that could have existed if not for betrayal. A permanent reminder, in the heart of Portland, of what was stolen and what was rebuilt. The trap was complete. Marshall had returned to Portland, won its most prestigious contract, destroyed everyone who'd betrayed him, established generational wealth for the innocent victims, and ensured his name, or rather, his father's name, would be celebrated long after Lance and Carrie were forgotten. 7 years of planning, 7 years of building, 7 years of patient, methodical revenge. And it had worked perfectly. Chapter 8. Unexpected Alliance. Marshall was reviewing architectural plans in his Portland office, the top floor of a building Apex had just acquired, when his assistant interrupted. "Sir, there's a woman here insisting on seeing you. No appointment. She says her name is Whitney Rice and that you'll want to hear what she has to say about Lance Crane." Marshall's attention sharpened. "Send her in." Whitney Rice was in her early 40s, professional, but with an edge that suggested hard-won survival. She carried a leather portfolio, and moved with the confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate hostile rooms. Mr. Titan, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. You have 5 minutes. Make them count. Whitney sat without invitation, which Marshall respected. I was married to Lance Crane. Briefly, 8 years ago, before his situation with you became public. Marshall's expression didn't change, but internally, calculations shifted. Go on. He was already involved with Carrie when we married. I didn't know. He married me for my family's money. My father owned a small construction firm. Lance convinced Dad to make him a partner, then systematically looted the company. By the time I figured out what was happening, the business was bankrupt and my father had a stress-induced heart attack. I'm sorry for your loss, Marshall said, genuine despite himself. Dad survived, but the business didn't. Neither did my marriage once I discovered Lance's affair with Carrie. I've spent the past 7 years rebuilding my life. She opened her portfolio. I also spent those years documenting everything Lance did. Every fraud, every lie, every manipulation. I originally compiled it for divorce proceedings, but my attorney said it was overkill. She slid a thick folder across Marshall's desk. I know who you are. I know you're Marshall Crane, operating under a new identity. I know what Lance and Carrie did to you, and I know you've been systematically destroying them for the past year. Marshall made no move to confirm or deny. Why bring this to me? Because my revenge was limited to divorce and restraining orders. Yours has resources I don't. And this, she tapped the folder, contains information even you probably don't have. Financial crimes that predate your situation. Other victims Lance defrauded. Evidence of a pattern that makes him a serial con artist, not just an adulterer. Marshall opened the folder. Bank records, forged documents, testimony from other victims, a paper trail of fraud spanning 15 years. It was comprehensive, damning, and beautifully organized. What do you want in exchange? Marshall asked. Nothing material. I rebuilt my life. I'm a forensic accountant now, ironically. But I want Lance to face real consequences. Your legal revenge was elegant, but it was civil. This, she gestured at the documents, is criminal. Federal crimes he's never been charged with because victims didn't know how to connect the dots. Marshall studied Whitney Rice with new appreciation. She wasn't looking for money or revenge sex or any of the usual motivations. She wanted justice, systematically delivered. I could use someone with your skills, Marshall said slowly. Apex is expanding rapidly. We need forensic accounting capabilities to ensure acquisition targets are clean. Interested in consulting work? Whitney smiled. Depends. Is this consulting work, or is this you hiring me to help destroy Lance completely? Why not both? They shook hands. Marshall had found an unexpected ally, someone whose hatred for Lance matched his own, but who brought professional discipline to the execution. Over the next 3 months, Whitney and Marshall worked together meticulously. They forwarded the evidence to federal prosecutors, carefully anonymized but impossible to ignore. They connected Lance's frauds across state lines, establishing federal jurisdiction. The investigation launched quietly. Lance didn't know he was being investigated until FBI agents showed up at his apartment with a warrant. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, bank fraud, falsifying business records, tax evasion. Each count carried potential prison time. Together, Lance was looking at 20 years minimum. Marshall watched the news coverage with Whitney in his office. Lance's perp walk, handcuffed and humiliated, played on loop across local stations. Thank you, Whitney said quietly, for finishing what I started. Thank you for the ammunition, Marshall replied. I could have destroyed him financially, but this is permanent. Lance's trial was scheduled for 6 months out. His public defender was overworked and underfunded. The evidence was overwhelming. Conviction was virtually guaranteed. But Marshall wasn't satisfied with just Lance's destruction. There was one final element to address. Gabriel had visited 3 more times since that first confrontation. Each time, the teenager brought his siblings, Sophie, now 13 and carrying her brother's anger with quiet determination, the twins Emma and Noah, 11 and confused about why the man who raised them had disappeared. Marshall maintained distance, never quite acknowledging the paternal relationship they wanted. But he listened when Gabriel talked about foster care horrors, about Sophie being bullied at school, about Emma's anxiety and Noah's behavioral issues stemming from abandonment trauma. The trusts helped. They'd been moved to better placements, had access to therapy, had stable educational environments. But money couldn't replace what they'd lost. You could still be in our lives, Gabriel said during his fourth visit. Not as dad, if that's too much, but as someone who gives a shit. Marshall had built walls 7 years ago. Gabriel was systematically dismantling them. What do you want from me? Marshall asked, genuinely unsure. Help us be okay, Gabriel said simply. You don't have to love us. You don't have to forgive Mom and Lance. But help us get through this. We're not them. We're just kids who got screwed over. Marshall looked at this teenager who'd sought him out, who'd refused to accept abandonment, who demanded accountability with the same determination Marshall brought to business. I'll think about it, he said again. But this time he meant it. Chapter 9, Resolution. The Columbia River waterfront opened 18 months later on a perfect June morning. 50,000 people attended the dedication ceremony. Mayor, governor, city commissioners, and a crowd that stretched from the Willamette River to the development's furthest boundary. Harold Crane Memorial Plaza anchored the center, 3 acres of green space with that bronze family sculpture Marshall had commissioned. The artist had outdone herself. The figures seemed alive, frozen in a moment of joy. Marshall stood at the podium, no longer Marshall Crane and not quite Marshall Titan either, but something evolved beyond both identities. My father taught me that what we build says everything about who we are, he told the crowd. He believed in structures that lasted, in craftsmanship, in leaving the world better than you found it. This development honors that philosophy. He didn't mention the betrayals, the 7-year exile, the systematic destruction of everyone who'd wronged him. That was private victory. This was public legacy. The ceremony concluded with the mayor officially naming the plaza, unveiling a plaque that read, Harold Crane Memorial Plaza, dedicated to family, integrity, and the enduring power of building something meaningful. Carrie was not in attendance. She'd left Portland 6 months earlier, relocating to Arizona where Marshall's reach was less absolute. She worked retail, lived in a studio apartment, and would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. Lance was also absent, though for different reasons. His trial had ended 3 months prior with convictions on all counts. Federal prison, 15 years, no parole possibility. He'd aged 30 years in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Whitney Rice had attended the trial every day, taking notes with professional detachment. When it ended, she'd sent Marshall a single text, justice served. But the most important attendees were standing near the sculpture, looking at it with complicated expressions. Gabriel, now 17 and taller than Marshall remembered. Sophie, 14 and carrying herself with a determination that reminded Marshall of himself. Emma and Noah, 12 and finally stable after years of chaos. Marshall had been meeting with them regularly over the past year. Not as their father, that door remained closed, but as someone invested in their success. He attended Gabriel's basketball games. He helped Sophie prepare for debate tournaments. He taught the twins chess and listened when they needed to talk. It wasn't the relationship any of them wanted, but it was honest. After the ceremony, Marshall found them near the sculpture. Gabriel was reading the plaque, and something in his expression made Marshall pause. He was a good man, your grandfather, Marshall said quietly. Would have been proud of this. Would he have been proud of you? Gabriel asked. Disappearing, coming back as someone else, destroying Mom and Lance. Marshall considered the question seriously. Probably not. Harold believed in forgiveness, in family reconciliation. But he also believed in consequences. I'd like to think he'd understand, even if he didn't approve. Sophie spoke up, her voice sharper than her brother's. You ruined our mother's life. Your mother ruined her own life through choices she made. Marshall corrected gently. I just ensured she faced the consequences of those choices. And Lance? Emma asked. He's our biological father. He's in prison because of you. He's in prison because he committed crimes, Marshall said. Multiple crimes, against multiple people, over 15 years. I provided evidence, but the crimes were his. Noah, quieter than his siblings, asked the question that mattered most. Do you hate us? Because we're his kids? Marshall crouched down to the boy's level. I could never hate you. Any of you. You didn't choose your genetics any more than you chose your parents' mistakes. You're victims of their choices, same as me. Then why did you leave us? Noah's eyes filled with tears. We needed you. The question gutted Marshall. 7 years of justification, of righteous anger, of perfectly logical explanations. All of it evaporated in the face of a 12-year-old's hurt. Because I was broken, Marshall admitted. Your mother and Lance broke something in me, and I didn't know how to stay. I thought leaving was the only way to survive. I was wrong about that. Are you still broken? Gabriel asked. Marshall looked at these 4 children he'd raised for 9 years, lost for 7, and tentatively reconnected with over the past year. They'd been innocent victims of adult wars. They'd survived horrors he'd inadvertently contributed to by disappearing. And despite everything, they'd sought him out. They'd demanded he be better. They'd refused to let him hide behind wealth and reinvention. I'm less broken than I was, Marshall said honestly. You helped with that. All of you. Sophie's expression softened fractionally. The trust you set up. That was you, wasn't it? Anonymous benefactor, Marshall said with a slight smile. Could have been anyone. Right? Gabriel snorted. A mysterious billionaire just decided to give 4 random foster kids $50 million each. Stranger things have happened. They stood together in Harold Crane Memorial Plaza, surrounded by thousands of people celebrating Portland's future. The development stretched around them, sustainable, beautiful, everything Marshall had promised. What happens now? Sophie asked. With us, I mean. Are you just going to keep being the rich guy who shows up occasionally, or what? Marshall asked carefully. Or are you going to actually be part of our lives? Gabriel finished. Not our dad. We get that ship sailed. But family, in whatever form that takes. Marshall had spent 7 years building walls. These kids had spent the last year persistently chipping away at them. Maybe it was time to let the walls fall. I'm not good at family, he admitted. I'm better at buildings and balance sheets. Good thing we've got 4 of us, Emma said with a slight smile. We can teach you. Something in Marshall's chest unlocked. Not forgiveness of Carrie and Lance. That would never come. But acceptance that these children deserved better than his absence, regardless of genetics. Okay, he said. Family, in whatever form that takes. Gabriel extended his hand, formal and serious. Uncle Marshall? Marshall shook it, then pulled the teenager into an unexpected hug. Uncle Marshall works. Sophie joined the embrace, then the twins, until Marshall was surrounded by the 4 people he'd thought he'd lost forever. They weren't his children genetically, but genetics had never been what mattered. What mattered was showing up, building something, being present even when it was hard. Harold Crane's lessons, finally understood. 3 years later, Marshall stood in the same plaza, watching Gabriel graduate from high school. Full scholarship to Stanford, courtesy of the trust fund. Sophie was thriving in a performing arts program. Emma and Noah were excelling in middle school, stable and happy. Lance was still in federal prison, with 12 years remaining on his sentence. Carrie had disappeared entirely. Rumors suggested she'd moved to Nevada, but Marshall didn't care enough to verify. Clark Hoyt had retired from Oregon Development and moved to Bend, accepting his diminished circumstances with grace Marshall respected. Whitney Rice had become Apex's CFO, her forensic accounting skills making the company virtually immune to fraud. And Marshall, no longer hiding behind the Titan name, having legally reclaimed his identity as Marshall Crane 2 years prior, had built an empire worth $5 billion. Portland's skyline bore his mark. His materials revolutionized construction worldwide. His name was synonymous with visionary development. But his greatest achievement wasn't measured in buildings or billions. It was measured in 4 young people who called him Uncle Marshall, who'd taught him that family wasn't about genetics or betrayal or revenge. It was about showing up, even when it hurt. About building something meaningful from ashes. About understanding that the best structures weren't made of steel and concrete. They were made of resilience, forgiveness, and the willingness to try again. Marshall Crane had left Portland broken and betrayed. He'd returned as a billionaire seeking revenge. But what he'd found was redemption. And that, in the end, was worth more than any empire. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.